All right, hello everyone. My name is Zoe Sargent. I'm one of your TAs for Psych 2700, and I'm really excited to give you a guest lecture on autism today. First, just a little bit about me. I am a second-year PhD student in the Jaswell lab, generally in the developmental area, but also my lab specifically focuses on autism and the social experiences and relationships of autistic people. Um, and I'm a Virginia native. I'm from Chesapeake, and so this is a picture I took in the Virginia Beach area with my dogs. and yeah, I just wanted to share that a little bit about me, and I love any excuse to share a picture of my dogs. But especially because I'm here to study autism, I'm really excited to talk with you a little bit more about it. And today we're going to be broadly focusing on a few different things. One, get a better understanding of what is meant when we talk about autism spectrum disorder. Usually you hear me say autism, and that's one because it's shorter, and also because a lot of members of the autism community seem to prefer that kind of language, whereas autism spectrum disorder can be kind of pathologizing. Which leads into our second overarching goal. We'll talk some about the importance of working with and talking with autistic people, especially in the research we do, and as we're producing knowledge about autism, just the importance of involving autistic people themselves in that process. And so that also kind of ties into the third goal, which is what are some ways that research on autism is conducted? This is a research institution, and one of the main goals of this class is to talk about how we study how children develop and everything. And so we'll be focusing on that as well throughout the course of this lecture. But generally, as an outline, the things we're going to talk about are the diagnosis and features of autism, autism prevalence, how it is caused or the etiology, development within autism, and we'll spend a little time at the end talking about adulthood statistics as well as interventions. So first, I just want to make a point on my language use. You might have already heard that I tend to use identity first language instead of person first language, and just a bit on what that even means. Person first language is a construction similar to person with autism or person with ASD or something. And people who use person first language emphasize that well, autism is a stigmatized condition, and sometimes people might forget that someone with autism is a person first. And so it's important to highlight that in the way that we talk about autism. However, a number of autistic people argue that for a few different reasons. One, that autism is not a negative thing, like you would say a person with cancer or a person with some kind of disease, but you wouldn't say a person with blackness or a person with intelligence for traits that are neutral or positive. And so separation seems to indicate a view that autism is negative, and also a lot of autistic people say, autism is central to who I am. I can't separate myself from my autism as I might, a handbag is something that people compare it to. I don't carry my autism around with me. It's who I am. I have an autistic brain. I am autistic. And so those people prefer identity first language. And there's been a few research studies, as well as lots of discussion just within the community and online forums and things like that, as to what kind of language is best. And some prior research in the UK and Australia suggested that autistic people do tend to prefer identity first language. And most recently, in some work that is still being written up and is going to be presented this spring, that here at the Jaswell Lab, we did a survey of people in the autism community within the United States and Canada and asked them what language they prefer to use. So in one of the questions we asked, which of these terms, and gave them a whole bunch of options, which of these terms would you use to describe yourself, or if they weren't autistic themselves, to describe your family member or your friend, someone you know. And you see here that on the left, these bars are The proportion of people in our sample who said that they would use at least one of the identity first terms we offered, like autistic or autistic person. And then these bars here on the right are representing the number of people who said that they would use one of the person first terms we offered, like person with autism. And you'll notice that the identity first bars are higher, especially in the people who were their own connection to autism, that is, people who are autistic themselves. Generally, close to 100% of them said that they would use at least one of those identity first terms, whereas much fewer said that they would use a person first term. And you see a similar pattern, although not as striking of a difference, for people who had another connection to autism. We also, with the same list of 10 terms, asked them to rank from 1 to 10, which do you like the most and which do you like the least? And we asked about 10. I'm showing 4 here because 10 would be a lot to fit on the screen. But basically, these top 2 are identity first terms, so autistic or autistic person, and these bottom 2 are person first terms. And just a couple things that I'll point out. Circled in red here is the percent of people within the group who is autistic themselves or not, who said that and each of these terms would be in their top half versus bottom half of terms. And the darkest blue bars here are the number of people who said it was their number one choice. So autistic and autistic person really stood out. They were the highest endorsed terms as far as the percentage of people who said it was their number one choice. And they were also the highest endorsed, just generally looking at which terms did people include in their top 5 versus bottom 5. And person with autism and person with autism spectrum disorder were a little more mixed, where only about half of participants in either group, autistic or non-autistic, included them in their top half of ratings. But you can also see these dark blue bars are a lot smaller for these terms versus autistic and autistic person. So generally, what we can see here is a couple things. One, even within this study and the other ones that have done previously, there's a good bit of variability in people's preferences, even within the autism community. You'll notice that even people who are autistic themselves, it's higher than 0% who said that they would describe themselves with a person first term. And same thing here, number of people who ranked these terms in their top 5 or even their number 1, it's more than nobody. So there is a bit of controversy, but overall the preference within the autism community, and especially autistic people themselves, seems to be for identity first language. So that's how I tend to talk for presentations like this. Obviously, if you're talking with a friend and they are autistic, it's obviously best to ask them how they prefer to be referred as and refer to them as such. But in the absence of being able to do that, I mix it up a little bit, but generally use identity first terms. So that was a quick language note. Into our outline for today, I want to start by talking about how autism is diagnosed and what are some of the common features of autism. So if you've taken any other psych classes, you're probably familiar with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is how a lot of mental and psychiatric conditions are diagnosed. And this would be used by medical doctors like psychiatrists, or people who have studied psychology, like psychologists with a PhD or a PsyD, and sometimes even master's level clinicians, would use the descriptions in this book to decide what diagnoses can and should be applied to people that are coming in to see them. Usually describes first what someone has to present and then qualifies how it has to present. So for diagnosis of autism, first you need to show what the DSM calls persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. So this would be someone who doesn't make a lot of eye contact, someone who has difficulty understanding sarcasm, things like that. And the second main category that needs to be represented is what the DSM calls restricted repetitive behaviors, patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. So for repetitive behaviors, this might look like hand flapping or rocking back and forth. And restricted interests, or what's sometimes called special interests, would look like maybe someone who really, really likes trains and learns everything that they can about trains and train schedules, and might have trains lined up all in their room and want to talk with everyone about trains, or someone who's really interested in turtles or their favorite TV show, something like that, where it goes beyond a typical level of a hobby or interest and becomes something that someone is like really motivated to learn as much as they can about, or to talk about a lot, or to play with, or something like that. And so those are the two broad categories of behaviors that have to be observed for someone to have a diagnosis of autism. And then as far as how, I guess the qualifying of how it presents, it needs to be present from early in life, even if it's not noticed early on. It has to create some kind of difficulty for the individual, what the DSM calls clinically significant impairment, and it can't be better explained by another developmental condition like intellectual disability or global developmental delay. And a lot of research has focused on this first category, persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction. And so I want to pause there for a second and talk a little bit about some of the research that has been done there. You'll notice from what you probably read in your textbook, and from the DSM descriptions even, and lots of things that you'll read about autism, is oftentimes autistic differences are framed unilaterally as deficits. And this has also led some people to notice the atypicalities in social behaviors that autistic people present. Those have been interpreted as suggesting a lack of social motivation. So someone, for example, who looks away during a conversation, seems to be not very interested in interacting, and perhaps that explains autistic behaviors generally, that autism is caused by decreased or absent social motivation. But there's a few arguments against that theory, that approach of interpreting autism research and autistic behaviors. One of which is that there's a lot of autistic people themselves who report being highly socially motivated, who really want to make friends and to interact with other people. And there's some empirical research backing that up too. And one particular train of research that kind of counters, I guess, this hypothesis that social motivation deficits are core to autism is an increasing line of research on social camouflaging, or what's sometimes called masking, where autistic people hide their autistic traits in order to try to pass as neurotypical or non-autistic, in order to fit in social settings. And this can be beneficial in some settings. It can function to help people fit in, but also oftentimes comes with a mental health toll. But I think what's important about just increasing acknowledgement that this is something that autistic people are engaging in, especially autistic women and people who are assigned female at birth, is that to camouflage or to try to mask your autistic traits, you have to be motivated to do so. And so a lot of the people who are engaging these behaviors are doing so because they're very motivated. They're trying to fit in socially. So a deficit in social motivation doesn't seem to sufficiently explain all of the social difficulties that autistic people have, which has led some other people, including an autistic scholar named Damian Milton, to propose what's been called a few different things, including the double empathy problem. And the basics of this approach of understanding and describing autism is that social difficulties are inherently social. So we can't really look at an autistic person interacting and just locate that individual's characteristics as the cause of social breakdown, because necessarily they are interacting with another person. And there is a back and forth between these people who are interacting. And so, especially in his 2012 paper where he outlines the double empathy problem, Damian Milton explains that the breakdowns in communication and rapport that we see among autistic and non-autistic people aren't just due to autistic deficits, but in fact, a mutual challenge in understanding each other. That's where double empathy comes in, is that autistic people might have difficulty understanding non-autistic people, but also non-autistic people have difficulty understanding and responding to autistic people. And it's that interaction that leads to some of the poor social outcomes that we see. And that leads to the study that we read today in preparation for class by Granieri and colleagues, where um, they basically found that, well, first, I guess to review a little bit how they conducted their study, they had 55 autistic young people ranging from 8 to 17 years old, split into 8 groups, roughly matched on age, and had them interact with each other and then indicate how much they liked or disliked the other kids in their group, and talking about each one individually, how much they liked or disliked them, whether and how much they'd want to play with them again, and who they would say that they're friends with. And then the researchers also had these same children complete the ADOS, which is the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, and it's kind of like the gold standard in confirming an autism diagnosis for research, and also gives a scale for a bunch of specific behaviors where someone can be higher or lower in, for example, atypical vocalizations. And contrary to what the researchers expected when they were reviewing the results from this study and these interactions with these kids, they found that kids who had atypical vocalizations actually received greater social preference ratings from the other kids in their group. And kids with atypical eye contact also had greater social preference ratings and more friendship ratings. And kids with reduced facial expressions also received more friendship ratings. So these atypical behaviors that are oftentimes associated with autistic deficits seem to be functioning in this case to increase the autistic children's evaluation among their autistic peers. There's also some drawbacks from some of these atypical behaviors, even within this sample of autistic children, where kids with atypical vocalizations did have fewer reciprocated friendships, and kids with moderately reduced gestures received fewer friendship ratings. But I think generally an important thing to point out here is that it was not unilaterally negative. That is, kids who are higher in certain autistic traits weren't necessarily less socially desirable among their autistic peers, but in fact, sometimes those atypical behaviors made them more likable to their peers. And this is a part of a line of research that includes some studies like the one we just talked about with kids, and also a lot of really interesting work with adults looking at the idea of the double empathy problem and pushing back on some conclusions that are drawn when we just look at autistic people interacting with non-autistic people and see challenges and attribute it to the autistic person. The study that we just talked about didn't do this, but some studies with adults have looked at kind of in combination autistic and autistic dyads, or non-autistic and non-autistic dyads, or mixed dyads, where someone in a pair is autistic and then the other person is not, and look at social outcomes that way. And the results of those research studies have generally also supported the idea of the double empathy problem, where breakdowns in rapport can't just be attributed to the autistic member of a dyad. And in fact, autistic social interaction might be more successful than in those mixed dyads. So we're focusing on the child research here because this is a child development class, but if you're interested in some of those adult studies, feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to share them with you and talk a little bit more about them. But basically, some important takeaways from those, and then the Granieri and colleagues study we just talked about, is that autistic youth might actually prefer the friendship of other individuals who share some of their atypical social interaction style, which has some implications for the way that we intervene in autism, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it might support the attempts to encourage friendships among autistic youth and not just try to get autistic young people to behave in ways that are more like their non-autistic peers so that they'll be accepted by them. Um, and Also, beyond just this study, some of these atypical behaviors might have useful functions both in social settings and then also personally. So, for the eye contact example, someone who is talking, an autistic person who's talking with someone and averts their gaze, might find eye contact to be really aversive. They might find it really difficult to maintain eye contact with someone and be able to focus on what they're saying because they are struggling to interpret what they're seeing in someone else's like eye gaze and stuff like that. And so it might be easier for them to pay attention and engage in the interaction if they look away. And so all of that is to kind of come back to this question of whether the differences that we notice in autistic people can be unilaterally applied to interpreted as deficits, and I think they can't. I think we really need to understand how some of the differences we see might not be harmful and just generally aren't necessarily deficits, and in fact might be helpful, such as the examples we just talked about. Um, so that generally is all focusing on behaviors that fall in kind of the social communicative domain. But there's also some other features of autism that aren't included in the DSM, but are commonly experienced and found among autistic people. Um, so one of those is sensory differences. So some people describe experiencing hyper or hyposensitivity. So that could look like an autistic person who's very, very sensitive to the light and the sound of fluorescent lights, or an autistic person who is sensory seeking and, might read seek out different textures and stuff like that and like feel walls because they really they might be hyposensitive and really want extra sensory stimulation. And then also some people, yeah, are just generally really sensitive to sound or tactile senses. So certain clothing textures might be very uncomfortable for an autistic person. So another domain that is not included in DSM but is experienced by a lot of autistic people is difficulty with motor planning or coordination. And some people describe, for example, I intend to press this button, but then my body does something else. And the way you might hear some autistic people talking about that is like separating what they want to do from what their body does. And there's kind of like a disconnect there where it's hard for them to get their body to do what they want it to do. And that is kind of an extreme case, but generally we do see evidence of motor differences being an important feature of autism. And then lastly, this falls a little bit in social communicative differences, but a lot of autistic people use spoken language differently and less than non-autistic people do. So from this study, which is the last one to kind of give an estimate of the percent of people who do not use spoken language reliably to communicate, suggested that about 30% of autistic people fall in that category, sometimes called minimally verbal or nonverbal or non-speaking. And that doesn't mean that they don't use any spoken language at all. Some people might just use limited sets of words or phrases. Some people might use echolalia, which is repeating what other people have said either immediately or at a delay. And then some people within this category might not use spoken language at all. So That is generally some of the diagnosis and features of autism, both included in the DSM and not. And next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the prevalence of autism. So first, what is prevalence? It means how many people, in this case in the United States, have this diagnosis at a given time, whereas incidence is the number of people over a given period of time, so say a year, who get a new diagnosis of a condition. So this statistic here, prevalence, is explaining how many people, and in this case, children, have a diagnosis. The CDC determines this through a lot of different monitoring networks and locations throughout the US. And essentially they go through medical records, school records, etc., and count up the number of people who have an autism diagnosis versus the total population. So this latest estimate from data from 2016, but published in 2020, suggests that 1 in 54 children at age 8 in the United States have an autism diagnosis. It's also important to note here that boys are about 4 times more likely than girls to be diagnosed with autism. And there's some debate as to whether this means that autism is just generally more likely in males based on features of the condition and how it comes to be, or whether our diagnostic criteria have an inherent male bias where the way that we understand and describe autism is generally in reference to studies that have been done with autistic males and at that rate, young white boys. And so there's also comparative underdiagnosis in racial and ethnic minorities as well. So that's just worth keeping in mind. But that is prevalence. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about etiology. So that is the manner in which a condition starts. So in this instance, we're going to talk about what causes autism. And before we really get into the current science, I also want to talk some about myths that are commonly talked about with regards to the causes of autism. And even if you're not super familiar with autism, you've probably heard a little bit of talk about these myths. First was the idea of refrigerator parenting. It seems to come from the observation, at least in early clinical descriptions of autism by men like Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger and some other people, that they described the autistic children they observed as seeming to not really be interested in interacting with their parents. And of course, this could be from misinterpretation of these autistic cues, and very much was in a deficit framed approach like we've already begun to talk about. But basically, they suggested that these autistic kids didn't seem to be interested in interacting. And then Bruno Bettelheim did a lot in the 60s to promote knowledge about autism, but in so doing, talked a lot about basically proposed this idea that autism was caused by refrigerator mothers or by parents who were cold and aloof and not very caring to their children, and that is what caused these children to decrease their interest in social interaction and everything. And then that is what caused all these other behaviors that were being observed. So you can imagine the impact that that had on parents at that time. And even today, when you look at blogs or other non-scientific websites, you'll see a lot of people continuing to spout these theories. And there's also still a tendency among parents when their child is diagnosed to feel feelings of blame and like self-blame and shame, and kind of wonder about what they did that caused it. And that could be in part because of just this really powerful historical influence about refrigerator parenting being what caused autism. But there is not research to support this. And in fact, this research on autism and attachment has shown that parents of autistic children are similarly sensitive and caring to parents of non-autistic children, and autistic children are no less likely to be classified as securely attached versus their non-autistic peers. So that is just generally that claim about refrigerator parenting. And then another one, which is unfortunately still much more popular that you have also probably heard of, is the theory that vaccines cause autism. This comes primarily, pretty much entirely from one researcher who published finding that or argued that a preservative commonly found in MMR vaccines, which is part of the typical healthy baby regimen, was actually causing children to develop autism. The only issue with this finding is that it was totally made up. And allegedly, this scientist had ties to groups who were advocating a lawsuit against businesses that create vaccines. So there's potential that he was biased there, but basically he cherry picked his findings, misrepresented the science, and published this study. And then the same journal that originally published it has since retracted it. So you can't find a copy of this article without seeing that it has been retracted. And in fact, so many studies since then have failed to find a link between vaccines and autism. But unfortunately, a lot of really influential people continue to push this narrative and use it as a reason that children should not be vaccinated or that people in general shouldn't be vaccinated to this very day, including our former president. So yeah, those are both myths about how autism is caused, things that are very much not supported by the science. But what do we actually know about how autism is caused? The answer is not a whole lot. We believe that it is a genetic and neurologically based condition. The neurological part partly comes from evidence that it co-occurs with epilepsy. So you can see on this figure here, kind of representing some of the different studies that have been done to look at how often autism is associated with epilepsy. Estimates range from about 7 to 61%, which would suggest that there is something neurologically happening that is associated with both epilepsy and autism. But importantly, it's not a one-to-one thing. So just because you have a diagnosis of autism doesn't mean that you also have a diagnosis of epilepsy or vice versa. So they're separate, but they seem to have some kind of neurological link. You see a similar story with genetics. It's clear that there's some kind of genetic component, partly from twin studies and baby SIB studies. So in twin studies, which we've talked about some already in this class, they compare rates of autism among identical twins versus fraternal twins, who both sets of twins generally should share relatively similar environments, although we've also talked about the idea of active child and how even within the same household, no two children have exactly the same environment, but should be relatively similar. And then fraternal twins are no more genetically related than our identical twins, but identical twins tend to be much more likely to both be diagnosed with autism than to fraternal twins. So these twin studies suggest that heritability could be anywhere from 64 to 91% genetically. And then also, in addition to twin studies, it's pretty common within autism to do baby SIB studies, where when a toddler or someone is diagnosed with autism, then later children in that family, so like younger siblings, are tracked from the time that they're babies and compared to a group of babies with no immediate relation to autism, and look at the likelihood that children within these groups go on to show signs of autism themselves. And the recurrence rate in these baby sibling studies range from about 7% to 18%, which also suggests that there is some kind of shared genetic component, although obviously these aren't as controlled as twin studies where you have a better idea of the level of genetics that are shared. And of course, as we talked about, environment is really complex even within these twin studies, so we can't draw super simplistic conclusions from these, but it does seem to have some kind of genetic basis. But when we talk about genes, then people might want to know, well, what genes cause autism? And there's actually been a lot of research looking for candidate genes that might be associated with autism likelihood. And there's been a whole lot that have been listed. But generally in these studies, it's only the associations are slight enough that a given gene or a combination of genes might predict like 1 to 2% of cases of autism, but certainly not all of them. It's leaving the rest unexplained. And as research in this field continues, it seems more and more that a whole host of genes are likely implicated in autism. And we can't narrow it down to 1 or 2 that are really uniquely tied to predicting autism outcomes. And so that relates a little bit to implications of how we treat autism and just, or generally for the research that we do. A lot of research does focus on biological and genetic causes. As you can see from this graph that is kind of breaking down in 2016, all the different areas to which autism research funding was given. This yellow section here, which is the largest, is the section that was focusing on biology. And then this next biggest section is also on risk factors. So basically, there's a lot of emphasis on understanding what causes autism. And part of the implication of that is kind of an emphasis on finding ways that autism can be cured. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go a whole lot into that argument, but there's a lot of autistic people who push back against that, as you might predict. And if you're interested, you can look online because there's a lot of people kind of talking about their ideas of the search for an autism cure and whether it's even something that we should be focusing on and giving so much of our research funding to. So that is something to keep in mind. And I'm going to talk a little bit about development. We're going to start by talking about especially theory of mind, which is something that we've been talking about in class. And I'll tell you about one early influential study, and then we'll take a break, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the critiques of this kind of research. But yeah, just last week we started talking about theory of mind, which is the understanding that other people can have unique interests, perceptions, and desires. So there's been a whole lot of studies on linking theory of mind and autism, but I'm going to highlight the first one that really showed there to be a link. And so generally, we talked some about the Sally Ann task, so I don't want to go into it way in detail, but basically there's a marble put in a basket, and then Sally leaves and they put the marble in a box here, and then Sally comes back in and the experimenter asks, where will Sally look for the marble? So Baron Cohen did this task with a group of autistic kids who you'll notice are higher in chronological age than the typically developing reference group, and also with a group of Down syndrome children. Yeah, notably, 16 of the 20 autistic children failed this Sally Ann task on both trials. And importantly, though, even in this first study where a link between autism and theory of mind was suggested, there was still 4 autistic children who passed on both trials, suggesting that theory of mind challenges, or the absence of a theory of mind, is not universal to autism. At least some children can pass this task at this age. And additionally, in the other groups, there wasn't perfect performance among the typically developing or Down syndrome children either, suggesting that theory of mind challenges also aren't unique to autism. So we're going to talk a little bit more about some other research that's been done with regard to autism and theory of mind. But first, I encourage you to pause, take a bathroom break, go get a drink of water, whatever you need to do, and we'll pick up the recording shortly. Okay, I'm going to keep talking. I hope you've had a good break. And yeah, so one really interesting and I think important paper that came out not too long ago walked through some of the empirical claims that autistic people lack a theory of mind and highlighted just what we just said. There's not sufficient research to suggest that theory of mind challenges are universal within autism, that is experienced by every autistic person, nor are they unique to autism. So only experienced by autistic people. And then this study also talks about how theory of mind challenges noticed early in development aren't necessarily predictive of autism outcomes. So if you're interested in reading this article or want to learn more, I'd be happy to share it with you. But generally just wanted to point this out and thought this is an important point because there's also been people who have argued, similar to the whole social motivation hypothesis, there have been people who argue that theory of mind challenges are part of what's core to autism and is part of the cause of all the autistic behaviors that we see. But this paper would suggest that's not likely to be the case. Also, it's important to consider a child's motivation in the task, particularly Sally Ann task that we're studying. You have to think about the child basically has no extra reason besides just being right to correctly indicate where Sally would look for the marble. But if you can motivate the child in a task to demonstrate the same kind of knowledge, then you can't say that they lack that kind of knowledge. And that is exactly what Peterson and his colleagues and their colleagues did in this 2013 study. So basically their paradigm was there's a child and an experimenter, and they also had two friends, Dot and Midge. And in front of Dot and Midge were 3 boxes, and then the experimenter put a present in one of the boxes. And then one of the friends, let's say Midge, leaves the room, and the experimenter moves the box to another location. And then here's the crucial point. The child picks one of the two friends, Dot or Midge, to look for the present. And if they find the present, they get to keep it. But if they don't find the present, the child gets to keep it. So when Midge comes back in the room, who do you think the child should look for the present? In this case, the right choice would be Midge, right? Because Midge didn't see the present being moved. And in this study by Peterson and colleagues, they had children who were autistic and young children who were not autistic do both the Sally Ann task and this one. And you'll notice that the percent of children who perfectly passed the Sally Ann task was only 13%, or 3 of these 23 autistic children, whereas 74%, or 17 of the 23 children, perfectly passed the Dot Midge task, suggesting that these same children could show their competencies better on one task versus the other. And in this case, we're much more similar to the older age 4 children, at which case children are generally expected to have a pretty well-developed theory of mind, at least to be able to pass these kinds of tasks. Yeah, and in this one task versus the Sally Ann one, they performed much more similarly to a typically developing comparison group. So it's important to think about the tasks that we use to study autism, and especially social cognition and development, and think about how the demands of the tasks might play into the kinds of results that we find. And this is transitioning off theory of mind a little bit, but as we talk about development, I also think it's important to talk about how particular settings can influence how an autistic child develops. And in this case, educational settings. So this study that I'm highlighting here studied children with high support needs, including autistic children and children with other diagnoses who were in general education classrooms. And importantly, they matched these same children to those who were in separate classes on their diagnoses, as well as a lot of different variables, basically their abilities at starting out this longitudinal study. And then over a period of time, looked at how many of these children progressed or didn't progress at all, or actually regressed in their communication, literacy, and numeracy skills. And as you can see in this figure, substantially more children, and all of these came out to be statistically significant, substantially more children progressed when they were in general education classes versus in separate classes. So this kind of highlights that the way an autistic child develops might not just be predicted by their individual characteristics, but also the opportunities that they're given to learn and to grow, potentially by the academic setting that they're in, but we can imagine lots of other important environmental influences as well. So those are just the quick note that I wanted to make on development as well as theory of mind. Next, we're going to talk some about adulthood statistics. So there's some debate when we talk about adult outcomes in autism of what we even study or what we should be looking for. And that'll continue to come up throughout this section of the presentation of the lecture. But basically, we're going to start out by considering something that is a little bit more likely to be agreed upon as an objectively desired outcome. And first, though, I want to point out that autism is a lifelong diagnosis. So we've been mostly talking about children in this class because it's a child development class. But of course, because autism is a lifelong condition, autistic children grow up to be autistic adults. And in that same pie chart that we looked at earlier, where there's a lot of focus on biological causes, there's very little, only about 2% represented in this pink section here, focusing on lifespan issues. That's not to say adults can't benefit from research on services and treatments, et cetera, or services here, treatments and stuff here, but it is important to think about, well, autism is a lifelong condition, and we spend very little money understanding what are the experiences of autistic adults once they reach adulthood and age out of services that are often provided through school systems or focusing on reaching autistic children. So that is just a bit of a note on autism in adulthood, but also I want to talk some about common co-occurring conditions that we see. And generally, co-occurring conditions, sometimes you'll hear them called comorbidities, is basically when you have a physical condition and a mental condition, or multiple mental conditions or something, basically two overlapping diagnoses. And this graph you're looking at here has on the x-axis odds ratios, which are a little bit funny to interpret, but basically means that someone here at like 2, someone with an autism diagnosis is 2 times as likely as someone without an autism diagnosis to also be diagnosed with sleep disorders. And you'll see on this graph, I think it speaks for itself. You can see kind of a list of a bunch of different conditions that someone with an autism diagnosis has increased likelihood for, notably schizophrenic disorders here. There's also a whole lot more that obviously I won't talk through this whole table. It's a lot to look at, but I want to point out a couple things. One, Parkinson's, basically there's like down here, I believe it was like 33 times more likely to have Parkinson's if you also have an autism diagnosis versus not. And there's a lot of other things here that I'll let you pause if you want to look at on your own time. But some other things I just generally want to point out. is that the odds ratio for diabetes and cardiovascular diseases was also right around where hearing impairment is. And unfortunately, the odds ratio for suicide attempts is about as high as attention deficit disorders. So that means that the odds of having attempted to take your own life are about 5 times higher if you are an autistic adult than if you are non-autistic. And so objectively, that's a negative thing, right? Like I can't really imagine anyone arguing that we want to do anything but decrease cardiovascular and problems and diabetes and suicide attempts in autistic adults. But also there's other ways that people have described outcomes that are a little less objective. And in fact, most of the research looking at treatment and intervention outcomes and generally just studying adult outcomes in autism focus on the remediation of autistic traits. That is, could someone no longer be classified as autistic based on the current behaviors that they're showing? So basically, this outcome, just to rephrase, is whether an autistic person no longer appears to be autistic. And that is how these researchers in this meta-analysis of outcomes for autistic people defined poor or very poor outcomes. Those were the people who still appeared to be autistic by the end of the studies that were included in this meta-analysis. And about 67% fall in that category. But also, arguably, that might not be what we want to study when we're thinking about outcomes for autistic adults. And that leads into something that we've been talking about throughout the lecture and mentioned a little bit at the beginning, which is the importance of including autistic people in autism research. If you ask autistic adults whether no longer appearing to be autistic is the optimal outcome for an autistic person, they very likely tell you no, and encourage you to look at other things like how is their well-being supported? How are they accepted for who they are and encouraged to flourish given their talents and needs? And more of a focus on the supports that can be given to them, rather than do they no longer appear to be autistic. And when we formulate our studies around particular outcomes or methods or results that don't really get at either the right outcomes that we ought to be looking for, or the right methods, kind of like we talked about before, where looking at only autistic and non-autistic people interacting, or on the Sally Ann test, measuring theory of mind in that way, we might be missing autistic competencies that could be brought out with other methods. And that's part of why it's really important to include community members in the research that we're doing. For most any research on a marginalized group, but especially autism, where there's still a bit of pushback. Fortunately, there's been a tide changing in autism research where more and more autistic people are being included in the research that's being done, but it's still far from enough. So it's just worth thinking about that as you come across studies of your own, or as you come across things about autism, kind of think about, was an autistic person or group of people included in the making of that research study or those materials? And if they had, how might things have been different? Or if they were, what are some of the takeaways that we can see from this resource and how it might differ from resources that don't include autistic perspectives? So we've talked through diagnosis and features of autism, prevalence, etiology, development, and some adulthood statistics. And right here at the end of our lecture, I want to talk about the status of some current interventions and treatments in autism. So to start, it's important to notice that there's a lot of controversy here as well, and I don't have enough time to talk about it as much as I would like to. But basically it comes back to what we were just talking about as far as how do we define what is a good outcome for autistic people? And if it is to appear non-autistic, then you might have a focus on training autistic people to display behaviors that are approximating those that you would see by non-autistic people, which is very common among behaviorist methodologies, which is the most common kinds of treatment that is applied to autistic people. And especially, you might have heard of applied behavior analysis, or ABA, where current recommendations are for children from a very early age, basically as soon as they're diagnosed, to start 30 to 40 hours a week of ABA, which, to put that in perspective a little bit, you might notice like that's as much as adults work in a full-time job, and that is how much these children are, or parents are encouraged to put their children in this kind of treatment. And basically the premise is that if you want to change someone's outcomes, you focus on changing their behavior. If you want to change their behavior, you start by identifying what it is you want to see, and then reinforce approximations of that behavior that's your goal, and potentially punish behaviors that aren't what you want to see. So if you want to teach someone to brush their teeth, you might reward them for picking up the toothbrush, and then once they consistently pick up the toothbrush, you might just reward them when they put it close to their mouth. And in that way, kind of, that's called like chaining, where you selectively reinforce approximations to a complex task, where eventually the goal would be for someone to be able to independently pick up their toothbrush and brush their teeth when they're getting ready in the morning. But there's some controversies, like I mentioned, about this kind of treatment, both for how it's approached as well as how effective it is. Just the approach itself is kind of controversial because, as I've described it, you might notice it sounds kind of similar to how we train animals. And oftentimes autistic people are given like edibles or snacks to reward them for doing a behavior that is what they're being trained to do, and in a way that is very similar to like dog training, which is kind of dehumanizing, and rubs a lot of people, including autistic people, the wrong way. And then also, just again, the recommended implementation is about 30 to 40 hours a week, which is not very feasible and takes a lot of money, like insurance, to that people might not have access to even pay for that much treatment. And yeah, with children's needs, like that's not necessarily feasible because oftentimes, children have to be in school or something like that. And so that is just kind of critiques of the approach itself. There's also there's limited evidence of its long-term effectiveness, both in some recent meta-analyses that have been done. There's not a lot of evidence of benefits past around the time that the intervention is taking place, as well as the behaviors that you want to see generalizing outside of the specific behaviors that are being focused on in treatment and the specific contexts that are being included in treatment. So there's not really that generalization of complex behaviors that we would hope to see if we're trying to support someone in developing adaptive life skills, for example. And actually, from some anecdotal self-report and also some empirical evidence, there's potential for long-term harm, where autistic adults report compare ABA to abuse, and mention there's a study that has found that autistic adults who engaged in ABA for long periods of time were more likely to display symptoms of PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, than adults who didn't engage in ABA or for as long. And there's very limited evidence there, and obviously this is still very controversial, but there's enough evidence of potential harms, as well as limited empirical evidence of benefits that should give some pause to ABA being the only and the most widely accepted treatment for autism. Also, I meant to mention a lot of the studies as well that have been done on ABA effectiveness feature a lot of bias, aren't very well controlled, and some of the things that we look for in high quality empirical studies, they don't quite meet those requirements. So even this treatment that is touted as empirically supported, there's actually limited empirical support for it. So some other interventions that we might think about include, based on some of the research that we talked about earlier, potentially supporting autistic peer support if autism is not necessarily just a problem located in the individual, but from a mismatch between autistic and non-autistic people, then potentially pairing autistic people up with other autistic people. They might be able to support each other in that way. And there are some trainings to kind of turn the question on its head and train non-autistic people to understand autism better, to be more accepting of autism, and to understand better how to effectively interact with autistic people versus just a focus on the opposite way. So those are just a few notes on interventions. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening. If you're interested in hearing more about autism, my advisor, Vikram Jaswal, teaches a 400 level class called Autism from Neurons to Neighborhoods, in which you have the opportunity to read some really interesting empirical articles and talk with other people about autism, both from a scientific perspective and about the lived experiences of autistic people. And if you're interested in talking more, I love talking about autism. I'm super interested in it, obviously, because that's what I'm here to study. So you can feel free to reach out to me. My email's there and also on the syllabus if you would like to talk more about anything that I brought up or autism in general. So with that, thank you so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.